Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving one additional round of applause to our entire panel. So I will try to briefly summarize a few of the many things that I heard during each of their presentations, and then we will transition to the Q&A portion of today's panel. So I think one of the first things that we heard during, I'm going to say Dr. Yoshi's presentation, with regards to the science is that there's a lot that science can teach us about these viruses, but we must also heed the lessons that we have learned both from prior large outbreaks such as the 1918 pandemic, but also smaller outbreaks perhaps in countries outside of the US that may not have risen to international significance. Specifically, H5N1 and H7N9 did not reach 1918 pandemic levels, but there is critical learning from those viruses and from experiences with those viruses that can benefit both our research communities as well as our response communities. In terms of looking at vaccines and the emergence of new medical countermeasures that might be able to assist us in combating the next pandemic influenza outbreak, we learned from Dr. Fauci that our seasonal flu vaccines are not consistently effective, primarily because they're often based on predictions regarding what prominent strains should be included in the vaccine, but overlaid with additional challenges of rapid mutations in viruses. I think the major lesson there is that we need to move more toward 21st century technologies for vaccine production that might enable us to stay ahead of these rapid mutations and give us a more proactive approach as opposed to the reactive approach of chasing the next pandemic. We learned from David about the IHR and PIF frameworks and that they both represent webs of activity that integrate public health capability, economics, and also preparedness for pandemic influenza. But these activities must also be viewed through the political lens as well for achievement of optimal use and effectiveness. And then finally, with regards to One Health and unifying themes, I think the major learning there that I heard was that there are still a number of global health challenges associated with this work. Virus sharing, insufficient surveillance, but the hope is that work is still underway to assess those global risks and move us forward. So for those of you in our audience who have questions, I would remind you that there are microphones available in each of the two aisles. And while you are gathering, I will start with the first question, which I would pose to Dr. Yoshi. So Dr. Yoshi, you spoke about the unique pathogenicity of the 1918 virus. In your opinion, where are we in terms of systems or research methods that are readily available to us now to identify new viruses with unique pathogenicity or severe pathogenicity that we can begin to address before there is an outbreak?
So before outbreak, so the pathogenicity of influenza comes from two different angles. One is the virus itself. Virus, as I described, some of the viruses are more pathogenic than others. But at the same time, also the immunity in the population affects the size of the outbreak. Now, 2009 pandemic, some people may call it wimpy. However, when you look at the virus itself, especially like in children, it caused severe disease. So the reason why the epidemic was not big was because the older population had immunity to the virus. So it comes both ways. Now, coming back to your question, so we can sort of predict the pathogenicity, or we can identify the level of pathogenicity in animal setting, the experimental setting. But that doesn't tell you the magnitude of the outbreak because of the reason I described. Immunity of human population affects the size of the outbreak.
Thank you. And we have our first question from the audience. Lori.
Yeah, Lori Garrett. I have toiled for a long time to understand and figure out what we could do about the way in Asia birds are processed for food. And whether or not an intervention that goes right at that could not stop the majority of the bulk, the lion's share of the pandemic threat. Because for those who haven't spent time in the parts of Asia from, say, southern Siberia all the way down to the bottom of the Philippines and Indonesia, the majority of all poultry is purchased as a live animal. The animal is usually studied carefully, which may include sniffing it and so on. So there's a fair amount of human exposure to that animal before it's purchased and then slaughtered by the purchaser for consumption. And I've toiled for a long time, and I would love the collective thinking from this wise group. How do we balance climate change concerns against the possibility of mitigating the threat of pandemics by encouraging refrigeration, personal refrigerators across Asia, and the possibility of people purchasing poultry the way we do, already processed safely, chopped up, wrapped up, and stick it in our fridge? And if we went to that scale where every single person in Asia had a fridge, it would jump, the CO2 emissions would skyrocket. On the other hand, the longer the population continues to have live animal exposure, there's this sense that we're just waiting for doom, that we're just waiting for that clock to run out.
Can I answer that question? So the change in the culture, it's not like refrigeration or anything. It's a change in the culture is not easy because it goes many, many years. But you can still mitigate. Hong Kong is a great example. Hong Kong increased the surveillance, and Hong Kong introduced method to limit the continuation of the viruses, circulation of the virus in the live poultry markets by putting the break in every month. And also they identified some of the bird species that carry more viruses and eliminate those from the system. So one can introduce mitigation strategies to reduce the risk. So I think that's what we should do right away. In the long run, we may have to change the system, but I think it is possible to reduce the risk by doing this mitigation.
Yeah, no, I would totally agree that Hong Kong is the perfect example that it can work. But in other parts of China, it is still, it's a very deep-seated cultural preference for fresh poultry. But in talking with Chinese colleagues, they see a day where the slaughtering at the poultry markets and the inspection of the birds, as you say, it will get phased out, but it's not something that you can just stop immediately. And I think that Hong Kong also introduced other practices at the live bird markets that actually separated the buyers, the people coming into the markets that were the ones that were really being infected, from the slaughter process itself. So there's multiple layers of mitigation that can be put in place. And I think things are slowly changing in the mainland China, at least. Other parts of Asia, Bangladesh, and other areas, it still is a harder. It's hard to see that being introduced, but I think certainly in China, it's coming.
I think from the political point of view, the best place to try that type of culture behavior changes within regional organizations in Asia as opposed at the global level. The cooperation within Asian organizations tends to be able to focus on sort of functional, non-binding approaches like that in ways that prove more effective than if it's seen as a global top-down, as opposed to it's a regional initiative taken on by those countries that share best practices across lots of different issue areas. So if I were going to pinpoint a place, governance place to do that, it would be in the regional context as opposed at WHO.
Next question. If you could please give us your name and your organization.
My name is Jerry Hush. I'm a sociologist. So this question was perfect. I worked at WHO for 10 years, actually, on dealing with interagency evaluations, Codex Alimentarius. And my question actually is connected to this last conversation in the sense that both a One Health approach, culture change, the complexity of the issue, and even the response in terms of a regional response. I'm very interested in the linkages both within organizations for sharing data, as well as a food system approach, so that we can understand much better in terms of One Health the links between epidemiology, for example, and all the other science. So what I'm struck with in my work is that there's a lot of talk about sharing data, integrated perspectives, the ability to have a new framework so that we can understand the way in which diseases move. And what I am curious about, and thank you for the panel, is how do you see us getting out away from simply talking about collaboration and sharing to actually doing the necessities of dealing with interagencies and all this kind of stuff? So where do you see us moving beyond talk to action?
Well, what has been there? I mean, that's a pretty blanket question.
I'll give you an example.
Yeah,
I'll give you an example.
One specific aspect of it is that there has been recently established a global health security network and a global health security agenda. One of the major reasons for that was, besides the broad blanket of surveillance and communication, is sharing data immediately in real time. So that when you have an outbreak, and the outbreak doesn't necessarily have to be influenza, it could be anything, it could be Ebola, it could be Zika. That's something that is moving. It isn't exactly the way we want it yet, but a number of countries have bought into that and made the commitment that they will be part of this network of not only surveillance but data sharing. So I think things are really happening besides speaking about it.
One interesting thing that I mentioned where data sharing is happening and it's causing governance headaches with the IHR, the PIP framework, and the Nagoya Protocol is the sharing of genetic sequence data. And apparently this is happening on a large scale. It's happening and people are making use of this. It's very good information. None of these regimes have a single rule about this. It's causing problems for all three. And the governance mechanisms are actually trying to figure out how do we deal with that kind of data, which is being globally shared and effective in a real-time manner. My other response to your question is this is something that governance regimes have to deal with, especially as they're trying to increase the transparency of information. And the idea is it's information sharing in the way in which you design the rules in the institutions. So it almost becomes part of the way in which the machinery of bureaucracy works. And we've really had to try to change, I know in the IHR, for example, it's a revolutionary change to the way, and it just takes a little time for that to happen. That's what was starting to happen. We saw that with H1N1. This is why the Ebola outbreak was just so, frankly, depressing, because it just all fell apart. And putting those pieces back together again after all the efforts just indicates how difficult this is, even when you have that governance strategy in place.
Yeah, I think you really hit on it's something that you have to keep working at. You have to exercise the engagement from multiple sectors. Outbreaks can force you to do it. Ideally, you don't want an outbreak to force you to do it, but you need constant planning. It should be part of national or local pandemic preparedness to understand who to reach out to in the veterinary sector or the public health sector, and then to continuously exercise that.
Thank you very much.
Oh, I'm sorry. I've heard some people claim that what we need to do is take that problem away from humans, give it to the machines, and use artificial intelligence.
No, we've had that.
and automate that.
Hi, Pia McDonald from RTI International. So going back to the comment about there being gaps in surveillance around, specifically for animals, if you were given, since there's not a ton of resources going into surveillance at this time, if you were going to suggest 5 priority countries to do surveillance in, which 5 countries would those be, and what is getting in the way now of doing that? Thank you.
So I think resources, as you say, certainly even in the US, the resources for animal surveillance are far more limited than for public health surveillance. And I think in some countries it's just not a priority. And also, if you don't look for it, you don't know it's there. And so that has huge implications for trade and for export in some countries. So there's an added negative impact of finding viruses in the environment. With respect, I think China's has really stepped up and is doing a good job on the agricultural side. Some more transparency in reporting, I think. I think there's many countries around the world that would benefit from the resources and recognition from their governments that it's an important area for pandemic preparedness. I don't think I can give you 5 off the top of my head. Maybe the other panel members would like to speak to that. It's not.
But surveillance needs to be everywhere. I mean, the reason we're balking at 5 countries, but we have a problem with surveillance in the United States. If we were surveilling the pigs, we would have picked up the swine flu of 2009 months ahead of when we actually had the first cases. So we tend to always say, as Laurie was joking just to me now, China, Indonesia, but the fact is, in our own backyard, we need to do better.
Absolutely, and I wouldn't just limit it to Asia. Africa is a huge problem right now. So there's lots of emerging influenza viruses there, and no resources to deal with it at all.
Suzzet, if I can cheat and ask 2 questions.
Go right ahead.
David, 1 question for you. And then first one, changing global governance is a long and messy process, and it's expensive and it's tiring. So, sure, changing global governance is a very tiring process. It's expensive, and it just saps the energy out of the world when you go into those discussions. So if you were going to focus on an area of global governance that could be improved and needs to be improved, where is it that you would focus attention? And then let me ask the second question then, so you can all think about this. So then Yoshi, Tony, and Jackie, you were all involved with the dual use discussions a few years ago. And I'm not actually quite sure where all of that landed, but I think that the question is that having gone through that and having had some time go by, do you think that there are questions related to the science of viruses that we should not ask? Or do you think that everything can be safeguarded one way or the other so that science is just open for investigating whatever can be asked about either viruses or any other aspects?
Which one do you want answered first? David, why don't you answer first?
I'll answer that. You're right. When you create something like the IHR or the PIP framework or other things that found these institutions, these rules, these processes, takes a long time, a lot of hard-fought negotiations. It can be politically controversial. So my recommendation isn't to let's create another initiative. We need to try to get the institutions and those parts of the regime complex that we've created operating much better on their own terms, and also in terms of their integration. And that's why I think there's no end of ideas where we don't have to amend the IHR, the PIP framework, and the Nagoya Protocol for purposes of making progress. Let's use those processes and practices and rules that already exist and continue to work those governance mechanisms. What we tend to see, though, is those things, we have lots of ideas, but the political attention goes off to the next bright and shiny object. And so we have this initiative and that initiative and this institution and that. We have this proliferation of things which has created this really tangled web of things. And I don't think we're concentrating either our political capital or economic capital in ways which are going to let us incrementally ratchet up the resilience of the key pieces of the governance that we have in place, IHR, PIP framework, and then making sure Nagoya gets integrated into those in such a way that we don't have a replay of the viral sovereignty controversy every time we have a dangerous outbreak.
So the system of trying to have some sort of oversight over what experiments should not be done is much better today in 2018 than it was several years ago when it was just very loosey-goosey, as it were. We used to have some oversight, but not. And it was usually after the fact, which was very awkward, where someone would do an experiment, get funded for an experiment, and then get ready to publish it, submit it to a journal, and then the journal editors would go, should we be publishing this? Which it's very tough to stop something from being published that's already been done and that's out there. So the system now, at least for work that's funded by the federal government, the one thing that people don't understand is that if you're not federally funded, the government has no control over what somebody can do and what can't do. And the big argument now, not argument, but the big focus that often gets misinterpreted is gain of function. In other words, if you want to anticipate, and Yoshi is one of the world's experts in not only the quality of his work, but the aggravation that he causes me all the time. Not really aggravation. But what happens is that the work that he does is really elegant. And when he asks questions of what would be the mutations that might change the way a virus acts, when those mutations are already occurring in nature, the fact that he wants to study it, we often question, should he be studying it? And every time we've done that, the conclusion has been yes, as a matter of fact. And he recently has one that we reviewed, that we put it through a very formal type of review, and it was clear that this risk-benefit was for the benefit of society. There are experiments that even common sense tells you shouldn't do. Should we get a microbe that is absolutely not spread by a respiratory route, and should we make it a respiratory route virus? That's different than one that classically does spread through respiratory route efficiently or inefficiently, and we're trying to find out what the amino acid sequences and the mutations are that make it go one way or the other. That's different than trying to create something that would never happen in nature. And that's the one that should never be done. And I think you probably agree with me on that, Yoshi.
Any other responses to that question before we move on?
No, I think what's been put in place for the US federally funded science is really a careful and thorough risk-benefit analysis and an understanding of the benefit to public health that would come from the results. And that benefit has to outweigh the risks. And I think having that in place before the work is done really generates a more thoughtful process as well as a safer process.
Good afternoon. I'm Bill Buckta. I'm the current president of the American College of Occupational and Environmental Medicine. And I have to say first, hats off to Lori for coming up with the basic public health approach to this whole problem, basically like John Snow removing the pump handle in London in 1854, just doing the basic thing. But going more toward the scientific or the technological approach, the universal vaccine will be created. It's coming. It has to. It makes sense. But what do we have to do? And this probably more for Mr. Fidler, to position ourselves to prevent the hoarding that we saw with Tamiflu, and the fact that I think last time I checked, of the 300 million dosages of the current lousy vaccine that we have are used right here in the United States. How do we get that distribution, get the mindset that this is something for the whole world? Then when we get that universal vaccine, it's not for a small group of people. How do we position geopolitically to get it distributed properly? And I guess that's the question.
Yeah, from a governance point of view, the willingness on the part of states, even with a technology like that, to move towards a system of universal access for a universal flu vaccine. Talk about a long and complicated negotiation that would probably produce the lowest common denominator and not eliminate the fears that we still have about hoarding, or even if promises have been made, when the crisis happens, the promises aren't fulfilled for political reasons. I don't know whether thinking about the universal vaccine has any implications for the types of initiatives, the types of arguments that have been made concerning the need to scale up influenza production and manufacturing around the world. I don't know whether that creates a different flavor for that discussion. That discussion, in terms of the system that we've got now, hasn't really moved the needle very much, but I don't know whether if you actually had that sort of technology, whether then you could actually address some of that problem, that political problem, on a functional level with just more global capacity, because you've got a different technology, and a different technology that's going to connect to the equity, I think, in ways that are far more clear.
So let me just add to that, because you really asked an important question, and I think there's sometimes a misunderstanding of that. Hoarding occurs when there's an outbreak and limited resources. That was the hoarding when we were expecting a big outbreak of flu and there was a Tamiflu problem. And then there was the Cipro problem with the anthrax and things like that. We don't have hoarding of measles vaccines. We don't have hoarding of pneumococcal vaccines. We don't have hoarding of other vaccines. So in the situation, which I hope will occur, that we do get a universal flu vaccine, that I would hope would become a standard vaccine for everybody. Because the reason there's hoarding is because you have an outbreak here. If you have a true universal flu vaccine, you could vaccinate the world against influenza the same way you try to vaccinate the world against polio, against measles, against smallpox, etc. So I don't think there would be hoarding if it truly is a universal flu vaccine and works.
I think we may have time for one more question.
It's the same question. Over to you. I know what you're going to ask.
I apologize. Mine is more of a quick statement. So my name is Ed Yu. I'm from the FBI's Weapons of Mass Destruction Directorate. The comment is that appreciate the theme of today's meeting. It's 100 years after the 1918 influenza pandemic, but it also is 17 years after the anthrax mailings. And wanted to showcase that the whole rationale for the development and the fruition of the Weapons of Mass Destruction Directorate in the FBI is to protect from the malicious initiation of a pandemic. So Dr. Fauci, you're famous for saying that the ultimate bioterrorist out there is Mother Nature, and we absolutely recognize that. But the fact of the matter is that the FBI, as a result of what happened, the close call that we had over the years, we worked jointly with the CDC and with the USDA, and on the preventative side have worked with state and local law enforcement, public health, and state veterinary programs to work together in collaboration to rapidly determine that if there's an unusual outbreak of some kind, to determine, is this a freak act of nature, or are there any indications of an intentional release? And I think that's important to note, that that's an unfortunate change or evolution of what we had to, how to address biological threats. And also at the same time, a different rubric of dual use that we don't take into consideration is the charge that the FBI has to protect the types of research that goes on, like Dr. Kawaoka's research, and that's another element of security that we need to take into consideration too. That is very valuable research, very important research, and how do we protect the people and the institutions that are conducting that work. So again, thank you for the panel, but I just wanted to throw that perspective in.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Well, on behalf of the organizing committee and the National Academies of Medicine, I'd like to thank our 4 panelists this afternoon for thought-provoking presentations as well as discussions. So thank you so much. And thank you also, yes, please give them a Thank you as well to all of you for being such an engaging audience. At this time, there will be a reception that will be taking place in the West Court, and if my directions are correct, I believe it's just outside the doors of the auditorium and to your right. Thank you all so much. Have a great evening.